You wake to bells that feel like blades cutting through your dreams. Your breath hangs frozen in the darkness of a dormitory that smells of unwashed wool and fear. You're 6 years old, maybe 7. You've lost count of the months since your mother kissed your forehead and walked away without looking back. Around you, 20 other children rise in perfect silence, their movements synchronized by terror rather than devotion. One girl, barely old enough to tie her own shoes, fumbles with the rough fabric of her habit. You want to help her. But you remember what happened to Emma last week when she whispered comfort to a crying child. 3 days kneeling on scattered dried peas until her blood stained the chapel floor. This stone fortress promises salvation, but it delivers something else entirely. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. It's wild to think we're scattered across the globe, connected by curiosity about these children whose voices were silenced centuries ago. This is England, sometime in the 13th century, during the height of medieval Christendom, when convents functioned as dumping grounds for inconvenient daughters. Places like Barking Abbey in Essex, Shaftesbury Abbey in Dorset, and Godstow Abbey near Oxford received girls as young as 4 or 5, not as students, not as willing novices, but as political currency. Noble families needed alliances with the church. They needed to secure inheritances for eldest sons. They needed to reduce the number of mouths to feed and dowries to pay. And so daughters disappeared behind convent walls, their childhoods traded for land grants and papal favors. Contemporary chronicles, confession records, and the marginal notes hidden in illuminated manuscripts reveal a world where systematic abuse was mistaken for spiritual discipline, where breaking a child's will was considered holy work, and where the screams of the young were drowned out by the sound of prayer bells. How did this happen? How did institutions dedicated to God's love become factories of trauma? The answer lies not in sudden cruelty, but in the slow, methodical transformation of children into something less than human empty vessels to be filled with obedience, walking corpses dressed in habits, ghosts haunting their own bodies. Lady Edith of Mercia was 4 years old when her mother delivered her to Shaftesbury Abbey in 1043. The chronicler, a nun named Elfgifu, recorded the child's arrival with clinical detachment. Parvula. Edith weeps without cease for 3 days and nights. Her tears freeze upon her cheeks in the morning cold. She calls for her mother, but we speak only Latin here. She must learn that her mother is dead to her now. Dead to her now. Edith's mother was alive, living in comfort less than 50 miles away. But the convent operated on a different logic. The moment those doors closed, a girl's past ceased to exist. Her family became forbidden memory. Her name was often replaced with a saint's name. Her identity was systematically erased. The physical transformation began immediately. Hair that had been carefully braided by loving hands was shorn close to the scalp, not trimmed, but hacked off with dull shears that left scalps bleeding and uneven. Soft silk gowns were stripped away and replaced with habits made of wool so coarse it raised welts on skin unused to such roughness. Shoes were confiscated. Bare feet on stone floors, even in winter, were considered spiritually beneficial. The children learned within days that comfort was sin, that softness was weakness, that any pleasure, even the warmth of adequate clothing, was an obstacle to salvation. At Godstow Abbey in 1185, 6-year-old Matilda Fitzwalter arrived with her favorite doll clutched in her arms, a gift from her father. The abbess personally took the doll from the weeping child and burned it in the courtyard while Matilda watched. Years later, in a letter smuggled to her sister, Matilda would write, "I watched her face turn black in the flames, and I understood that everything soft would be burned out of me too. They were not teaching me to love God. They were teaching me to fear everything, including myself." Silence wasn't golden in medieval convents. It was survival. From the moment of morning prayers, 4 a.m., when most children were still deep in the dreaming stage of sleep until the final bell at night, speaking was forbidden unless specifically required for confession or lessons. The children developed their own language of glances and gestures. A certain tilt of the head meant, "I'm hungry." A particular way of clasping hands during prayer signaled, "I'm sick." A specific posture during Mass communicated, "I'm thinking about running away." But even these silent communications were dangerous. The nuns watched constantly, interpreting every movement as potential rebellion. At Barking Abbey, the disciplinarian Sister Maynard kept meticulous records between 1203 and 1219. Her ledger reads like a catalog of crushed spirits. Alicia, age 7, struck 5 times with the willow rod for laughing during none. Margaret, age 9, 15 strokes for speaking during scripture reading. Beatrice, age 5, held by 2 sisters while struck 10 times for wetting her bedding. These weren't occasional punishments. The ledger documents multiple beatings every single day. Children lived in a state of constant hypervigilance, terrified of making mistakes they didn't understand were mistakes, smiling at the wrong moment, moving too slowly during processions, allowing their thoughts to wander during the endless hours of prayer. The psychology of this is devastating. Child development experts now understand that children need predictability, clear boundaries, and the security of knowing what behaviors will result in what consequences. Medieval convents offered none of this. The rules shifted based on the mood of whoever was watching. A child might be beaten for looking up during prayers one day and beaten for keeping her eyes down the next, accused of prideful displays of false piety. There was no way to win, only ways to lose. Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughter Joanna spent 3 years at Fontevraud Abbey in France beginning in 1176. Her letters to her mother, discovered in the Abbey archives centuries later, show a child slowly fragmenting under impossible pressure. "Dearest Mother, I have learned to move like a shadow and breathe like a whisper. Yesterday I was beaten for allowing my thoughts to wander during matins. How do they know what I think? I fear they can see inside my mind. I fear they can see my dreams of home. I'm trying to forget you as they command, but forgetting feels like dying." Food was weaponized. Not just limited weaponized. Children ate once a day, sometimes twice if the abbey was feeling generous. The fare was deliberate in its inadequacy. Barley gruel, black bread, water. Meat was forbidden, except on the highest feast days, and even then it was distributed in portions that would barely sustain a grown woman, let alone a growing child. At Wilton Abbey, breakfast consisted of a piece of bread the size of a child's fist and a cup of water. Dinner was thin porridge with perhaps a few vegetables. Children who arrived plump from noble households became skeletal within months, their ribs visible through their habits, their eyes too large for their shrunken faces. But the starvation served a purpose beyond mere asceticism. Hungry children are easier to control. They lack the energy to resist. They become obsessed with their next meal, unable to focus on anything else, including thoughts of escape or rebellion. They're more susceptible to illness, more likely to die young, and if they do survive, more psychologically dependent on their captors who control access to the most basic necessity of life. Agnes of Bohemia, daughter of King Ottokar I, was sent to a Poor Clares convent in Prague in 1234 at age 8. Her confessor, Brother Francis, wrote to her father with what reads like alarm. "Your daughter speaks of nothing but food. She counts the hours between meals. She weeps not for your absence, but for the memory of roasted fowl and honeyed wine. She has drawn pictures of feasts in the margins of her prayer book. This is not devotion, Your Majesty. This is starvation, producing madness." Winter in these stone fortresses was particularly brutal. Heating was minimal, a small fire in the chapter house, perhaps another in the scriptorium where valuable manuscripts were copied. But the dormitories where the children slept remained unheated, even when snow piled against windows and ice formed on the water basins each morning. Children slept fully clothed, often 3 or 4 to a narrow straw mattress, huddled together for warmth that never quite came. Frostbite was common. Illness was constant. and death was frequent enough that the nuns maintained a special shortened burial service for children to expedite the process. At Winchester Abbey in 1248, a 6-year-old named Isabel de Clare arrived from a wealthy Norman family. Her first winter nearly killed her. In her adult memoir, written after she finally escaped in her 20s, she recalled, "I remember the sound of teeth chattering in the darkness, like castanets played by invisible hands. I remember Marie, barely 5, who came from Normandy and spoke no English. She wept every night for her nurse. One February morning, she wouldn't wake. Her lips were blue as violets. They carried her away while we recited morning prayers, and we never spoke of her again. It was as if she'd never existed." Death was indeed common and unremarkable. Abbey records show child mortality rates approaching 30% for girls under 10. These deaths were recorded with bureaucratic efficiency. Johanna, age 5, died of fever on the feast of St. Michael. Margaret, age 7, died of wasting sickness on the feast of St. Luke. No surnames, no family notifications, no elaborate burials. They were interred in unmarked graves in the convent cemetery, their short lives reduced to brief entries in account books, their families often not informed until months later, if at all. The psychological techniques used to break these children were sophisticated in their cruelty. They were systematically isolated from everything familiar, subjected to constant surveillance, punished for expressing emotion, and rewarded only for complete submission. At Barking Abbey, the rule stated explicitly, "The young maid must be watched always, for in solitude she may remember her former life and grow sorrowful. When she weeps, she must be corrected. When she smiles, she must be questioned. When she speaks of home, she must be punished. Only when she shows neither joy nor sorrow, but perfect indifference to all earthly things, has she achieved the proper state of grace." Modern psychologists would recognize this as textbook systematic abuse designed to create learned helplessness. The children were taught that they were powerless, that resistance was futile, that their only hope lay in absolute obedience. They learned to dissociate from their own bodies, to view their thoughts as dangerous, to fear their own emotions as evidence of spiritual corruption. Yet, some children found ways to preserve fragments of their humanity. At Shaftesbury Abbey, archaeological excavations in the 1960s uncovered a cache of small objects hidden in a gap in the dormitory wall: a wooden doll with one arm missing, a piece of colored glass, a pressed flower so old it crumbled when touched, and a letter written in Norman French in a child's uncertain hand. The letter, carefully preserved and translated, reads, "My name is Aliénor. I am 7 years old. I have been here for 2 years. I remember my mother's voice when she sang to me. I remember my father's beard against my cheek. I remember my dog Rousseau, who would sleep at the foot of my bed. I write this so that someone will know I was here, that I was real, that I was loved. Someone did know. 7 centuries later, we know. But for Aliénor and the 20 other children sleeping in that frozen dormitory, no rescue came. The adults who should have protected them, their parents, the church authorities, the visiting bishops who surely saw the conditions, looked away. They told themselves that suffering was holy, that breaking children's spirits was necessary for salvation, that the screams and tears and silence and death were all part of God's mysterious plan. The legacy of medieval convent abuse extends far beyond the Middle Ages. The psychological patterns established in these institutions the belief that children's pain serves noble purposes, that obedience matters more than well-being, that questioning authority is dangerous echoed through centuries of institutional childcare. The Magdalen laundries of Ireland, the residential schools that destroyed indigenous children in North America, the orphanages where neglect was policy, all of them operated on the same fundamental lie, that breaking a child is somehow building them up. The bells that called Edith and Matilda and Aliénor to prayer have long since fallen silent. The stone walls that imprisoned them have crumbled into picturesque ruins where tourists take photographs without knowing what happened there. The abbesses who tortured them in the name of holiness have returned to dust. But the children remain, preserved in marginal notes and hidden caches, in the few letters that survived, in the archaeological evidence of their suffering. They remain as witnesses to a simple truth that every generation must relearn, that no cause, however sacred, justifies the systematic destruction of childhood, that suffering doesn't make children holy. It just makes them suffer. Tonight, when you lie down to sleep in warmth and safety, remember the children who slept on frozen stone with empty bellies and broken spirits. Remember that they were not statistics or historical curiosities. They were children who loved and feared and hoped and dreamed, just like children everywhere, in every time. And remember that the price of their suffering was paid not in spiritual enlightenment, but in trauma that echoed through their entire lives, the ones who survived at least. The ones who didn't became ghosts that no one bothered to name. The horror of medieval convents isn't that they were uniquely evil, it's that they were normal, accepted, praised as holy institutions serving God's purpose, and that normalization of child abuse, that willingness to look away from suffering when it serves institutional interests, remains the greatest danger of all. Because it didn't end with the Middle Ages. It just found new names, new justifications, new walls to hide behind.